First off, thank you for those of you who decided to join and participate in this webinar on a Friday afternoon before the holidays. Really appreciate your time today. Really, today's webinar is about grounding ourselves in what we accomplished in 2025, how we did it, and where we're going in 2026. And I'm hoping to use this opportunity for those of you who are willing to share would really like to solicit some feedback in terms of what you think we should be focused on in our priorities going forward. But let's begin by just briefly level setting and talking about what we plan to cover. So, who are we? What makes us different? We'll highlight some of our legislative victories and how those were possible. And then really, I think where I really want to focus a lot of attention today again is 2026 and where CaCOA should focus and as part of our legislative program. And then we'll segue into a little bit about member benefits and then hopefully for a Q&A discussion. Now, I want to note that we are CaCOA members on this call or on this webinar, but I'm going to assume that maybe this might be the first time you've joined us as part of a webinar series, and that there may be some folks that you might want to refer CaCOA to. So we want to provide some of those member benefit options. But again, the Q&A is really my biggest priority going forward. In terms of the next slide, we want to talk about before we jumping in, hopefully you'll take a quick poll, really highlighting what your biggest challenge is right now. These responses will hopefully help shape the conversation going forward. So I'll give you a minute to just take that quick poll so we can tee up the results in real time. And actually, it's prompting me to take the poll. So maybe I will. Okay. So, oh, there we go. So poll was tax burden 33%, illicit market 50%, regulatory compliance cost 17%. That seems to track. So appreciate you all for doing that. So in terms of moving forward, let's talk a little bit about who is CaCOA. So, taking a step back, obviously you can see some of the data here on this slide. But from my perspective, CaCOA launched in January of 2025. So we're less than 1 year old. And the real purpose and expectation behind the launch of the association was to really provide a voice for license holders in California. And I think we are well on our way to successfully achieving that objective. We are the largest cannabis industry association currently in the state. We represent 475 licenses across the supply chain and all segments of the supply chain from seed to sale. We have 300 operators with 200 plus retail stores located in 125 municipalities, providing access to more than 85% of authorized local markets. So our footprint is pretty vast, at least from a cannabis industry perspective. And then we serve roughly 50% of the population. And this has been a really strong message point that we've been communicating to the legislature as our new association that is advocating in Sacramento and beyond. But yeah, the real point was we wanted to capture and bring in members who are actual license holders and really represent that license holder perspective. So we are well on our way. In terms of, I'm having trouble. There we go. Try again. In terms of our mission and approach, we really exist to advance policies that support a functional legal cannabis marketplace in California. And I think what makes us different and a standout among the other association is we really focus on results driven advocacy, outcomes, not theater. We focus a lot on strategy. We run targeted, disciplined campaigns. Our first of which was very successful, was our AB 564 campaign to roll back the tax hike. We have worked very, very hard to bring positive or build positive, productive relationships with and credibility with our legislators. Again, this has all been done in a very, very short time frame, less than 11 months. And then we have a lot of data-backed positions. So we've really been focusing on data, soliciting input and feedback from our members. So a lot of quantitative analysis where I go in and I can talk very, very specifically about how certain specific policy objectives or legislation are impacting our individual members. So that's been something that we've widely utilized and has been really instrumental in our initial first year success. Our real goal ultimately is to become a trusted expert to the group of policymakers that we are lobbying in Sacramento, and help them really understand and have accurate information in terms of what's really impacting the legal cannabis industry, that real operator insight that I think we felt in some respects had been lacking in previous years. So really excited to bring that voice and perspective to our advocacy work in Sacramento. But I want to emphasize, I think one of our biggest strengths that I was really excited about working with Laura, who I will introduce momentarily, is really our media presence, which ran parallel to a lot of our legislative advocacy work in the state capitol this year. We were featured in over 50 publications just in the first year alone, and also served as primary testimony on behalf of the legal cannabis industry in more of a dozen committee hearings in the state capitol, including an oversight hearing where we focused very extensively on some of the economic analysis that had been coming out of the state capitol and things that had been commissioned by the DCC. So a lot of media attention around what we were doing in terms of our advocacy work, but also media attention around the overall state of the industry. So we're really, really happy with those first year achievements. And I credit a lot of that to the members of the team who I will be introducing momentarily. But first, let's begin with the board of directors. We have a really stellar group of legal operators that represent different aspects of the supply chain. Really, really pleased to be working with all of these individuals who are really shaping and guiding our policy going forward. So these are leading operators, distributors, manufacturers, retailers across the sector. And really, with this board, we feel that it brings unmatched experience, and they show up. They are very, very engaged in our day-to-day policy work and provide a lot of input and guidance to me in terms of what they would like us to focus on. So that's been a really exciting thing for the organization. In terms of staff, there are three. So first, that would be me, Amy Jenkins. I do serve as the executive director. I'm also the chief legislative advocate, also in the Capitol. We do have some other lobbyist support, but I've been serving as the chief lobbyist, advocating for a number of our priorities, and which I'll get into. For those of you who don't know my background, I previously served as the lobbyist for the California Cannabis Industry Association. I was proud to work with them for about a decade, and then joined CaCOA in January as part of our official launch. We also have on the team Josh Lewis, who is on loan to us from Embark. He's been fantastic. Josh covers all of our day-to-day administrative functions. He does a lot of the onboarding of new members, but he's been providing really extensive support and leadership, and has been instrumental in developing CaCOA's our strategic plan, including a significant portion of our work program as we go into 2026. And then last but not least would be Laura Braden, who has 25 plus years of experience in communications. I've been really privileged to work with Laura over the years on a number of policy initiatives, mostly in the cannabis space. And so Laura has been key and critical to ensuring that we are being heard in the media, that our messaging is getting out. And she's also been instrumental in building our campaigns, which involves a lot of legislative advocacy work that we engage our members on. So really excited to have this team, and hopefully will grow as the organization continues to grow going forward. So really, why join CaCOA? So I think that the important thing about being involved in an industry association, and I say this to everybody that I meet throughout the state, is we are the more we are power in numbers. So the more we can build and engage the legal cannabis industry, the greater opportunities we have for success in the capital. One of the ongoing struggles I've seen as a cannabis industry lobbyist over the last 10 years is we've had associations, we've had fits and starts with associations, we've had associations representing every segment of the supply chain. Some have gone away. This really is an issue of building membership so that we can provide the support to support our advocacy work in Sacramento, to tell our story with the media. So joining an association, I think joining CaCOA in particular is something that is going to aid in our efforts as we try to strengthen and improve the legal cannabis marketplace. So that's certainly why I'm encouraging everybody to join, and I certainly appreciate those of you who are on the call. But here's also just a general snapshot. So this slide just really focuses on some of the work that we are setting out to achieve. And again, we're just in our first year, in many respects, building a plane while flying it. But I think, again, policy and advocacy influence, market intelligence, business development, regulatory and crisis support, knowledge and professional development, and just community and brand building. So we really want to, again, build out this network where legal operators can continue to engage with each other while also strengthening and improving the health and viability of our industry through effective legislative and regulatory advocacy. So those are really important. So we do have a QR code where that members can just join. The nice thing is you fill out an application, and it's a pretty seamless process. Josh is very involved in this particular aspect of the organization. So moving on, I want to talk a little bit about our legislative victories. We had, despite a lot of challenges that the legal industry is experiencing, and I know that they are significant, we did experience and enjoy 3 legislative victories in the Capitol, which I think are really, really important to highlight. First is AB 564 related to the cannabis excise tax. AB 8, which was the regulation of intoxicating hemp products. And then we also had some online platform accountability work in SB 378, which is really intended to target illicit cannabis sales as well as intoxicating hemp sales. So I'll dive into those in a little bit more detail. So to begin, I think a lot of you are well aware of the work that CaCOA did in coalition with a lot of other groups to advance AB 564 Haney. This was the bill that was introduced to, again, preempt or roll, well, it was originally intended to preempt, but ultimately rolled back the cannabis excise tax from 19% to 15%, which represented approximately 26.6 to be exact, cannabis excise tax increase. This was pretty significant. And for those of you who participated in a lot of our calls to action and strategic advocacy work, I think you knew that the pressure that we were under to make this happen. To put this into context, this was really the only public policy or legislative initiative that actually rolled back a tax in this current legislative year. It was considered quite a monumental achievement when communicating with other industry groups and advocacy groups, because we have, again, are finding ourselves very challenged in terms of a state, and there's seems to be a greater emphasis on generating additional revenue. So being able to make the case to roll back a tax that would have represented a very significant tax hike for us was initially a very hard sell, but very pleased to say that we ultimately passed this bill with almost by unanimous bipartisan support. So very, very pleased with that outcome. Now, I will say, as it relates to this bill that's not in the slide, just but just by way of background, as the bill moved through the process, there were a number of amendments and concessions we had to take. And among those concessions was a 3-year reporting requirement. So the way this bill now works, which was the version that was signed by the governor, what will ultimately happen is we maintain that 15% excise tax now through 2028. And then there will be another opportunity, unfortunately, for that excise tax rate to go up, but not before a study is initiated to evaluate the health and viability of the legal industry. So I think we can all safely assume that we are going to continue to need and to focus on additional tax decreases. And so the hope is that that study will again continue to communicate the need for lower taxes and not actually that increase in tax it to 19%. But that was an amendment that was taken through the Senate appropriations process and not one of our own, but it is something to be aware of. So as an industry, we should all be mindful that 19% is still in statute and can still be triggered and go up, but not for 3 years' time. So we've been at least spared 3 years, and we'll maintain the rate of 15%, all the while continuing to tell the story of why we need to be focused on additional tax reduction measures. And I do hope too that at the end of this conversation, for those of you who are interested, you'll ask me, you feel free to ask me any questions about the strategy, the negotiations, why things happened the way they did. I think that's something that I would be interested in hearing from you and what is interesting to you in terms of how all this kind of shook out ultimately. But by and large, this is a huge victory, something to celebrate. If there's one key takeaway, I'll say beyond what I've already covered on this slide, is that due to the very incredible advocacy of the industry and CaCOA members, there isn't a legislator in the Capitol that isn't aware of the tax framework and the high taxes and regulatory burdens faced by the industry. And it's not to say that many hadn't already heard that, but I think we were able to convince the entirety of the legislature that the tax burdens on the legal industry are tremendous. And we even had key leaders within the legislature trying to figure out ways to actually further reduce that rate. So these are conversations that we're going to continue to have that will be ongoing for the next couple of years. Moving forward, we also achieved a major milestone with the passage of AB 8 by Assemblywoman Aguirre-Curry. She's also our Assembly Majority Leader. This bill was a multi-year process. In fact, I've been working on the issue of hemp policy since roughly 2017, which has also evolved over time. But what this bill ultimately did is it closed any loopholes as it relates to intoxicating hemp. And so what it has essentially done is establish a detect, non-detect threshold. So effective January 1, 2026, that piece, well, it's already in effect in emergency regulations, but it'll go into effect in statute. So any product that is derived from hemp or synthetic cannabinoids that contains any levels of THC is effectively banned in statute. It also provides additional protections additional enforcement tools for state agencies to go after illicit hemp. So, for instance, CDTFA will have additional search and seizure authorities. There'll be additional monetary penalties. And in fact, there will be opportunities to, in fact, revoke licenses of retailers in possession of tobacco licenses based on the number of times an inspector goes in and finds intoxicating products. So a lot of work went into this bill. We worked in partnership with the Newsom administration to advance this proposal. And after multiple years of effort to try to advance this measure and really close that intoxicating loophole, we were successful this year. The other piece of this bill that I think is really important to highlight is it also provides a path to integrate hemp cannabinoids into the licensed cannabis supply chain. But it does it in a very limited way. So what will happen effective January 1, 2028 or sooner, there will be an opportunity to accept hemp inputs into the licensed cannabis supply chain through a licensed distributor. Now, the caveat is the hemp inputs would be hemp biomass or CBD isolate or CBN isolate. So over the next few years, the Department of Cannabis Control will be developing regulations to allow for the integration of these minor cannabinoids into the licensed supply chain. And then in essence, those hemp inputs, once they come into the supply chain, would be subject to all the laws that govern cannabis. So essentially subject to MRCRSA. So again, a high, hard-fought win, a lot of very, very intense negotiations, and I want to really commend the work of the CaCOA board and also our members for helping to advance this measure. It was critically important. And the other key thing I think that's important to note is the fact that this was the first time really in the history of the cannabis hemp fights where the industry, the legal cannabis industry, really worked in coalition. We had every major industry group and other cannabis partners involved in these discussions. We had to take a lot of amendments to ensure we satisfied a lot of industry concerns. And I think we struck a really, really positive, good balance in the final product, though I would note there will be some cleanup legislation going into next year. So one thing I want to highlight is we do have a very, very substantive primer on AB8 and the implementation of AB8. So really strongly encourage you if you have questions or want specifics about the implementation timelines, because they are different, whether we're talking about the enforcement timelines or the integration timelines. I hope that you'll consider reviewing that primer. We worked really, really hard on the development of that. And I would note we did confer with the Department of Cannabis Control, who did review it for accuracy. So we feel pretty good about the content in there, and hopefully it will be very helpful. So please feel free to download that guide and let us know if you have any questions. The third major victory that I want to highlight relates to SB 378. Now, unlike the two prior bills, which were sponsored by CaCOA, SB 378 was a bill that we supported and helped advance, though it was sponsored by the United Food and Commercial Workers. And what this bill does is it essentially provides some additional enforcement tools to assure that online marketplaces such as Amazon are not profiting from facilitating illicit cannabis and hemp sales without some sort of accountability. So this was really an attempt to try to provide more teeth in existing statutes so that we can go after online platforms that are actually allowing for the sale of these intoxicating products that are otherwise banned in California. So I want to commend UFCW on this work. Again, CaCOA was very, very involved in the legislative advocacy behind this, and we are very pleased that this bill moved forward. I do think it's going to be interesting to see how this is implemented and what ultimately will come of it. But I think a real victory on the part of the industry, because those online sales, as we know, have gone up very significantly over time. And so this provides some additional enforcement tools. So going forward, just to highlight again what really drove these victories. So I think one of the key reasons that we were so successful this year is, again, our membership. So we ran several calls to action, had a number of different legislative action items that we encouraged you all to engage in, and the results were pretty exciting. We were able to build a database of over 1,400 employees, as well as a 2,000 plus database of consumers. So we really tried to use various online tools with your support to draw attention and raise awareness. And that actually translated into letters and calls and emails to the legislature in ways we hadn't seen from the industry. So I think that's really, really an important piece. Also, just to reinforce with the very active work on the part of our board of directors, we had a very successful legislative action day or a lobby day, which we did a lot of focused, targeted advocacy to try to advance these particular reforms. And then just having our licensed operators just providing that expertise and leadership. So we had some really, really strong data and compelling data that we were able to use to really tell our story, but we couldn't have done it without the mobilization of our members. So we thank all of you for the work and helping to advance these objectives. And again, we have a lot to celebrate. I know that things continue to be challenging, but this was a very, very successful year for the cannabis industry from the standpoint that we were able to do things that nobody thought possible. And that really came with your support for some of these calls to action and other efforts that we were promoting throughout the year. So now as we kind of get into the nuts and bolts and look beyond, I think it's really important to just highlight kind of what we see are the major areas that we need to be focusing on. So that first begins with that expansion of access, really retail access expansion as we commonly refer to it. We're still looking at about 2/3 of California bans the retail sale of cannabis. So really trying to explore ways to expand retail access. And that also is accompanied with local engagement. So we are really trying to do a lot of work to partner with the city and county trade associations, but then also I think our objective is to start really engaging in some of those local direct to city county efforts as well. But local engagement's has been a primary driver, and we did have the support of the League of Cities and the rural counties, as well as other local government associations in terms of advancing this year's agenda. And now we really want to hit home in some of the more challenging issues like getting them to open up their jurisdictions. So local engagement is going to be a big area of focus. And then exploring ways for enhanced or continued enforcement. I just got back from a conference where I spoke to 23 different state legislators and really talked a lot about really our existing enforcement tools on the books and the lack of enforcement that is actually happening against illicit market activity. So we're really trying to explore some different options to enhance enforcement against illicit. And when I say that, I'm not talking about compliance. I'm talking about illicit market enforcement against unlicensed operations. And then just more broadly, market stabilization. So that really goes hand in hand with all of these things. The more we can provide a stable, successful cannabis marketplace, the more you will be able to survive and thrive in this very challenging regulatory environment. So those are kind of the key pillars that we're really focused on as we go into 2026. So let me then segue into what I see are potential priorities. And I want to note here that this is where I'm really looking to CaCOA members to help me and inform me on what should be priorities. So this is Amy's brainstorm for now. Nothing actually has ultimately been approved by the board, but these are kind of the concepts that we're all exploring. So I want to run through these with you. And again, this is the point in the presentation where I'm really hoping that you will provide some feedback, at least for those of you that are willing during the Q&A period. So let's start with just the two top tier up here is I'm looking at, again, some AB8 cleanup, but then 564 cleanup. And this, so AB8 will just be making sure that everything in the MRSA code actually captures intoxicating hemp. There's some holes in there. There's been some concerns about maybe some loopholes around some testing of certain products. So we're really going through the current bill that was just signed by the governor and expect to see some cleanup there. So not all that sexy, but things that we'll need to ensure that there are no loopholes that can be taken advantage of. But the other interesting one that I'm the more I kind of do a deep dive into 564 is I think we'll need to do some additional cleanup around that bill. And this is our excise tax rollback bill to 15%. So as I previously noted, the legislature, not CACOA and not our coalition partners, added a reporting requirement, which says that the state must review the health and viability of the legal cannabis industry before they are to consider a tax increase. The dates don't line up in a way that I feel gives us a sufficient amount of time to really make our case. So once that report comes out, there's really a 30-day window for legislators to contemplate, what they want to do. And again, this 19% is still in statute. So I would like to explore, and again, this all is pending member input and board approval, trying to figure out how we tweak those reporting dates so that we, as a legal cannabis industry, have sufficient time to make our case to the legislature. I think it's probably safe to say that everybody that is listening to this today or viewing this today knows that 15% is still way too high. But it was the best that we could do under the current political climate. And I sure don't want to see any additional discussions about excise tax increases. So we need that time once that report comes out to advocate to ensure that there's no additional trigger to 19%. Now, getting into the more meaty issues is I'm also, again, working with the CACOA board, looking at potential retail access expansion concepts. So several years back, there was a bill, AB 1356. Some of you may be aware of it. It was authored by Assembly Member Phil Ting. What this bill did is it said that if a jurisdiction approved Proposition 64 with 50% plus one or greater, that they would have to authorize legal retail in those jurisdictions. And there was essentially it was a 15,000 population to one ratio. So for every 15,000, you would have to have at least one retail dispensary. Now, to avoid running afoul of Proposition 64, this bill also said that if the jurisdiction did not want to meet this mandate of establishing retail in their communities, they could go back to the voters for approval. So here we are, almost, I think we're looking at 8 years in since Prop 64 passed. And so as I'm kind of exploring other options, one of the options I'm looking at in lieu of having the trigger be a city that passed Prop 64 is just requiring all local bans to be approved. So when I referenced earlier that about 2/3 of the state has a local ordinance in place, most of those were enacted at the city council or the county board of supervisors level. And I've been reviewing Proposition 64, and there are a couple places in the actual language that says if you're going to ban, it requires local voter approval. So the other option would be running a bill that says, and again, this is to avoid running afoul of 64, that says if a local government banned via ordinance, that ordinance would have to go to the voters for approval. So these are some different options we're exploring, but the ultimate goal is to expand retail access in the state. And again, looking to CACOA members and others to provide some additional recommendations on how we achieve retail access, but this is the legislative path that I'm currently exploring. In terms of enforcement enhancements, there's a number of things under discussion. And as I alluded to previously, there's already a lot of enforcement tools within statute. The challenge is that the regulatory agencies just are not exercising those tools. So one concept that we're exploring is a False Claims Act for cannabis tax fraud. And what this would do is it would essentially allow civil actions leveraging whistleblower information. This is based on a successful model in New York, and there's already False Claims Act statute that is in California statute where whistleblowers can report to a local city attorney or a DA or the Department of Justice on potential violations of law. So we would extend that to illicit operations. So essentially, if there was somebody that wanted to come forward and communicate to the Department of Justice that they are aware of an illicit operator that is averting payment of excise tax, there would be a process where that could be undertaken, and the DOJ or a local entity could act. So that's something that we are exploring as a potential concept. But in kind of going back to the original pillars, you've got retail access and enforcement in here. One thing that's not in this slide around enforcement enhancements is a concept that the DCC advanced last year that was not successful in the legislature, but that related to padlocking. And what that would have allowed was the DCC to go in and padlock a facility where there was massive quantities of illicit cannabis. That issue or that concept was tabled largely due to some due process concerns that were communicated by the Senate. And my understanding is the Department of Cannabis Control is likely coming back with a revised enforcement concept. So that will be something that we'll explore should they choose to move forward and find an author and introduce a bill. The other thing that is also being explored that's not in this slide because it's largely conceptual is really a reevaluation of how we enforce against illicit activity more broadly. So it's a very bifurcated system in California, and I'm sure you are well aware of this. So oftentimes when we're reporting unlicensed activity, we're deferred to a local government. The local government refers us to the DCC. The DCC refers us to CDTFA. So there's a real interest on the part of a number of legislators, some of whom I met last week, in really examining our enforcement structure and maybe doing a whole revamp so that enforcement is managed by a single entity and that single entity would enforce tobacco, cannabis, and other illicit drugs like 7-OH, for instance, or nitrous oxide or intoxicating hemp. So I think there's a more broad discussions happening around enforcement. So stay tuned, and I certainly welcome and appreciate any recommendations you have in terms of ideas where we can explore and provide additional enforcement tools to address illicit market activity. Moving forward in terms of regulatory priorities, and I know I hear this a lot in some of the listening sessions that I participate in the field, is just the concerns coming out of the DCC and kind of that balance between compliance and enforcement. Compliance being targeted enforcement activities against licensed operators versus enforcement against unlicensed. So one charge that I think we're really motivated to move forward on is figuring out how to improve communications and transparency with the DCC. CaCOA, in partnership with some of the other cannabis groups, are working on some strategies to try to improve those lines of communication. There's been a request for additional listening sessions, for some additional recommendations. So I think you're going to see a lot of work in this area on the part of CaCOA in terms of ensuring that there's more clear lines of communications with the DCC, and we know more what to expect as it relates to some of the compliance actions that the DCC has been taking. And I should step back on this slide really and talk more broadly about the fact that I think with Director Elliott's pending departure, that provides a real opportunity to have that dialogue and communicate what we want and expect going forward as legal cannabis operators. So I think this is a really good opportunity and time to really explore, again, how we can improve that communication with the DCC so that we are not caught off guard. We know what to expect, and we, are also ensuring that compliance is consistent, so that we know what the rules are, and we can avoid those kinds of penalties and notices of compliance. So I know that's been an ongoing problem that's been communicated. And also just to be aware, the legislators who I spoke with at this last conference that I just returned from had communicated to me, at least a number of them, that they have been hearing from you about some of concerns related to compliance and how DCC is managing its compliance division. So I think there's a lot more work to be done in that area, and really look forward to soliciting your input going forward on whether that you deem that a priority and what suggestions that you might have. Moving on to potential threats. So I talked about kind of our proactive legislative work program, again, all in draft that we are exploring pending additional input. But I also think it's important to talk about potential threats that we know are coming. So one of our key achievements last year that I didn't highlight in a previous slide, but is worth noting, is there was a bill that was introduced, AB 762, by Assemblywoman Jackie Irwin. Some of you might be familiar with Assemblywoman Irwin. She does tend to run a lot of bills, that, unfortunately, that we've found objectionable. But her latest was a bill to ban the all-in-one vaping devices. So disposable vapes is a common term, but just those all-in-one where you don't have the battery that you could recharge. We successfully were able to table this bill last year. In fact, we were so successful, it didn't even get a hearing. So we were able to kill it last year. Our understanding is she's bringing it back in January. So this bill would ban all-in-one vapes. And the primary argument that we've been using against this bill is the fact that most all-in-one vapes are not actual legal, that are being found in landfills or thrown away unlawfully, are largely from unlicensed operators. So we were really successful in making the case that if you ban the legal all-in-ones, all you're doing is driving more consumers to the illicit market, which is producing really over 90% of vapes in the state. So we are expecting this bill to come back, and we will also be working in coalition with law enforcement and others to oppose this bill when it does. And I think it's probably safe to assume we'll see this in the first 2 weeks of the legislative session when they come back in January. Other areas where we are expecting to see legislation that could be highly problematic for the legal industry is around high potency cannabis restrictions. There was a Department of Public Health think tank that did not include stakeholder representation from the industry, that put out a scathing report and some really inflammatory data around high potency products. And so there's an understanding that we could see some legislation in this area that would essentially ban high potency products or severely curtail the manufacture of those products. So that's something that we're going to be closely tracking when the legislature comes back in January. And then there was also recently an audit that was conducted also at the request of Assemblywoman Irwin, related to child advertising and packaging restrictions. And there were several recommendations that came out of that audit, one of which included pre-approval by the DCC for all packaging before you could introduce a product to market. I don't think that is something that we would see in legislation, but I am aware that there are discussions and conversations within the legislature about implementing some of those recommendations. So that could be a real area of concern for the legal industry. And last but not least, I would just say too that what is not on this slide is also just the ongoing opposition that's coming from the third party or three-tier beneficiaries who have enjoyed cannabis tax revenue over the years. As we know, during the AB 564 fights, when we were trying to roll back the tax from 19% to 15%, they were extremely organized in the Capitol, advocating to maintain that 19% tax hike. So I fully anticipate they will come back again and try to make the case to accelerate that timeline declined from 15% to 19%. So we're going to need to be ready also to defend the 15%, which I know probably seems outrageous to many of you that we're being taxed that high already. But they are very organized and they have very, very passionate messaging around, you know, keeping cannabis out of the hands of children. They're also doing a lot of work to, just improve and boost social youth programming so they can be a very compelling voice in Sacramento. So we need to continue to reinforce the message that a viable cannabis industry is key to generating revenue that supports those important programs and that actually imposing an additional tax at a time when we are struggling is just a non-starter. But that is going to be an ongoing conversation that we're going to need to continue to have as we go into 2026. So, with all that said, that's kind of the key snapshot of what I think the industry may want us to work on. But I would really welcome and appreciate any input that you might have, whether it's on this call today or webinar today, or whether you would like to provide some input offline. From a timing standpoint, I am trying to build out this legislative work program before the end of the year, and we're already looking at November 21st. So I have limited time, but really want to reinforce the fact that we work for you, I work for you, and I would like to know what you're thinking, what you're hearing, what you need, what some of your pain points are, so that we can better ensure that we are looking out for you as our members and incorporating some of those recommendations into our work program going into 2026. So with that, I will stop and see if anyone has any questions or comments about anything I've covered today or anything I missed, and I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Hi, Amy. Laura here. We have actually 4 questions in the
Oh,
queue. Before we jump into questions, for folks who just need a minute to marinate on all of this, are you cool with me dropping your email in the chat?
of course.
Okay, great. So
Do,
Amy's
yeah.
email, just in case folks want to submit ideas or feedback later, just go ahead and give them that opportunity.
And I
Okay,
really want to emphasize that, by the way. I try to be as responsive as I can. But I love email from members because again, it really helps me figure out what the pain points are and what's important to you. So please feel free to email me.
great. So let's see, we'll give everybody a minute to submit more questions, but we have 4. I've ordered them just sort of in, I think, ease of answering to keep it moving. So the
Okay.
first one is, can municipal gross taxes being capped be achieved? So can we achieve the capping of municipal gross taxes?
Mhm. So that's a really good question, and the short answer is no. But there are some caveats to that. So whether you're a general law city or not, but right now the generally speaking, we can't cap taxes, but there are some creative ways that we can explore. But when we attempted to do that in the past, there were some constitutional issues, and we were told in most cases we would have to go back to the voters for approval. I will say that despite that, we have spent a lot of time talking about the Michigan model. We covered that actually in the conference that I just attended with legislators about how Michigan reallocates a portion of their tax collected back to local governments. So I think it's certainly a concept worth exploring, but prior attempts did run afoul of some of the existing constitutional protections for local government where you can't actually cap their taxes. So I'm happy to look into that and explore again. But yeah, we've had some challenges with that concept previously, just by virtue of what cities and counties are currently authorized to do in our Constitution.
Okay, great. Next question. Does AB 762, does it apply to all-in-one vapes, so like nicotine as well?
Yes. Yes. So it's actually, and thank you for that question. It applies to legal nicotine vapes and cannabis vapes. So I was fortunate enough to team up with, I never thought I would, but we teamed up with Altria and the legal tobacco industry to defeat this bill, though even the tobacco industry would say that their points weren't as salient or their messages weren't as salient as legal cannabis, but it did apply to both. And what really resonated again was the fact that consumers want what they want. And all-in-one vapes, whether you're talking about a tobacco vape or a cannabis vape, are very, very popular in California. So by the only entities that would ultimately abide by this new law would be the legal operators, which would just simply drive more consumers to illicit market options. And so we were very successful. But it was in large part due to the fact that the legislature was far more sympathetic to cannabis vapes. And we also wove in some patient arguments as well in polling patients and working in partnership with CalNormal. That is a primary intake product for cannabis patients, particularly those that have neurological issues and don't want to deal with the rechargeable pods. And so we were ultimately successful. But thank you for clarifying that. It did apply to both.
Okay, great. Next question. How do you see the leadership changes, particularly with the Senate, the state Senate, and DCC impacting what's possible in
Mhm.
2026?
Yeah. So, thank you for that question. It's a fun question for me. It's a little inside baseball, but it's critical. It's critically important. So, last week we actually saw a change in the Senate leader. So, the prior leader was, and I'm sure most of you are familiar, was Senate President Pro Tem Mike McGuire, who represented the North Coast. Mike McGuire is no longer the leader of the Senate. That the transition took place last week, and we are now looking at a new leader, and that's Monique Limon, and she represents Santa Barbara County, which has actually a lot of cannabis and a lot of hemp. Monique has previously chaired the Assembly Banking Committee while she was in the Assembly. She has very strong environmental credentials, very strong labor credentials. Most opine that she will kind of stay the course in terms of policy endeavors, but I find her to be very accessible and somebody that I think it really grasps and understands the plight of the legal cannabis industry. So I am looking forward to further building that relationship with her in my new role as executive director and lobbyist for CaCOA. So, and the way that translates even further, though, that I think is particularly important is not only are we going to have to shift focus and really start kind of building that relationship with her, is we also anticipate that there will be a number of changes to committee composition. So, most of our bills go through the Senate Business Professions and Economic Development Committee that's currently chaired by Angelique Ashby, a senator out of Sacramento. Senator Ashby has been pretty good on our issues, but generally doesn't tend to like cannabis. The assumption is that the new pro tem will likely change committee chairs. And so that could work to our favor, or that could be problematic depending on who she appoints. And I'm not suggesting that we will see a committee change, but it is anticipated that chairs will be substantially reshuffled under her new leadership. So that will force us to reevaluate strategy, reevaluate messaging, and maybe also put us in a position where we really need to change course and fine tune relationships with new senators that we didn't anticipate. And so too that could happen in the assembly, though I don't expect a lot of change in the assembly. We swore in a new assembly speaker. There's no expectation that he is leaving going into next year, but we're also preparing for an election year. So even as we look at 2026 and potential leadership changes, we're also going to need to plan and look outward into 2027, where we're going to see a whole new legislature or a whole host of new legislators coming in that we're going to need to inform and educate. And then there's the governor's race. So that's also something to consider as we look at all of the various candidates. Who should the industry be focused on? So those are things we're going to need to evaluate. as it relates to the DCC director, with Director Elliott's pending departure, I think the industry is really interested in seeing what those new leadership changes are going to look like. There will be some correspondence going out that was initiated by CaCOA and the other and some of our partners around wanting to see maybe some leadership new leaders come in that have a more business, like cannabis friendly perspective, perhaps somebody that comes from industry. So we're going to be pushing to see if we can shake up some of the deputy or even director positions and ensure that there are people in there that really understand the plight and concerns of the industry. Does that help? I felt like that was long-winded, Laura. I'm sorry.
No, I think that was super. I think that gets to the heart of it. And then last but not least, and so also just a call to the attendees, if there are any last minute questions, go ahead and drop them in the chat or the Q&A function. But last but not least, so you mentioned a lot of activities in support of our bills, but how can we as members be the most helpful to advocacy?
Oh, thank you. I love that. Thank you so much. Well, I want to commend the members so far. I mean, last year we asked a lot of our new members, as just new members of CACOA, to engage in legislative advocacy. We did a number of calls to action around AB 564 in particular, as the bill was moving through the legislative process. So we had a drill with the Senate President Pro Tem McGuire. We had a drill with Senate Revenue and Taxation Committee. We had a floor drill. So various efforts. And to that question, what I would say is when I communicate with you, Laura, and with Josh and the team and the full board, um, I'm very strategic in terms of when I am asking for the members to engage. And so, what I would just say in terms of how you can help, if we send out a call to action for you to submit a letter or send an email or make a phone call, there's a very strategic, compelling reason as to why we are asking for that and the timing with which we're asking for that. So I would just encourage all of you to please, when we do send those out, please respond. And rapid response is usually pretty critical because those are necessary and essential for us to do our work. So I do anticipate ramping up our calls to action next year. I won't do it just for the sake of doing it. It will be, again, when we really, really need member engagement beyond just the work that Laura, Josh, and myself do. So hopefully you'll be prepared to participate in those efforts. And thank you.
Okay, great. That is it for questions. So, Amy, thank you so much for your time. For attendees, we are going to have this posted on our YouTube in the next, well, probably over the weekend. So
Okay.
we'll post it into our members only group as well for anybody that missed it. Onward, upward. Let's
And
keep it
thank you to
going.
everybody too. And happy Thanksgiving to everybody. And I hope to hear from you if you have any additional questions or thoughts. I really welcome and appreciate your input. So thank you for your time.